Well, thank you all for being here, supporting this event. I'll tell you a little bit about myself to start. Back in '03, I had come really close to finishing my 8-year military contract, first with the active duty Army and then with the National Guard in Florida. It was an 8-year obligation. After I served my time in active duty in Texas, in Fort Hood, Texas, with the 4th Infantry Division, I transferred to the Florida National Guard, and I began going to school. And by January of 2003, I was very close to graduating from the University of Miami, and I was about to apply for a PhD program to become a clinical psychologist. And a few months down the road, I was about to end my contract with the military after 8 years. However, in November of 2002, Congress passed a law allowing the executive power to extend troops by a stop-loss order. So in January, when I was about to begin my final semester at school, basically the company commander called the company to attention, and he said, if you're about to get out of the military, you've been extended until the year 2031, and you're going to be activated for no less than 2 years in support of Operation Iraqi Freedom. So at that time, my initial position in relation to the war was that I opposed it politically, but I was also very sheltered. I was very much concerned with my own self, with my own well-being, with my life, with my career. And I did not have a very heartfelt opposition to the war. It was very political and very abstract. But when we got to Iraq, the first mission that we had was in this place called Al-Assad, where our job was to keep prisoners on sleep deprivation through psychological torture techniques, depriving them of sleep, depriving them of light, sense of space, putting guns to their heads, which were hooded with sandbags, in order to keep them up for periods of 3 and 4 days with no rest, in order for them to be, quote-unquote, softened up to be interrogated. So this was the first mission that we had in Iraq, and obviously there began to be a change in me in that I was no longer opposed to the war in a very abstract way, but I was beginning to be affected in a deeper way, on a deeper level, because this is not something that I was reading about in the newspapers or imagining, but this is something that I was doing myself. You know, this abuse, it becomes who you are while you're there. And yet there's so much fear and there's so much indoctrination within the military culture that it's really hard to break away from that, because you're very afraid and because you fear for your life and because you don't want to be rejected by your peers and things like that. So you go along with the mission. After that mission, we engaged the resistance in places like Ramadi and other units in places like Fallujah. We were in what is known in the United States as the Sunni Triangle. No such triangle ever existed in Iraq to the Iraqis, but that's what we call it. And once there, we engaged the resistance in combat, and by the way that we were conducting the missions, we were killing civilians left and right. We were doing everything opposite from our training. We were making ourselves predictable, conducting missions at places where we knew that a high number of casualties would result from the civilian population. And people basically wouldn't say anything again, because when you're being attacked like that, and when any piece of garbage on the road could be a bomb that will end your life or the lives of those who serve with you, it's very difficult to conduct a moral analysis of the war, or philosophize about it. You're just basically trying to get out of there alive. Then in late September of '03, after being 2 months in Jordan and 5 months in Iraq, I was given a 2-week furlough to come home. And when I came home and I no longer found myself under constant threat, I was able once again to go back to those questions that I had in the beginning, the philosophical questions, the moral questions, the questions about the legality or the illegality and the criminality of the war. And people began asking questions, of course, because I was fresh from Iraq, and people wanted to know if there was combat, if I had been shot at, if we had been ambushed, and things like that. And not realizing what this would do to me, I began to tell the stories. And these were stories that for the first time were coming to the surface because they had been suppressed in Iraq, because you can't really dedicate too much time to analyze what just happened to you when you're afraid that something else is going to happen. So you start, instead of thinking and trying to come to terms with the experience that you just lived, you're trying to figure out where the next attack is going to come from, whether you're going to survive or not, whether you're going to have to kill somebody or not. But once home, with a little bit of peace of mind and with the safety necessary to ask myself these questions again, I realized that there was a conflict in me between being a good soldier, or what the military considers being a good soldier, and being a human being with a conscience and with the ability to make his own decisions. And I realized that in order to be a good soldier to the military, I had to go back to the occupation, and I had to go back to my unit. And of course, I was very afraid of being rejected by my peers. But at the same time, starting with a political opposition to the war and then adding my on-the-ground experience in Iraq, I realized that I had to make a personal decision and that I had to live with that decision for the rest of my life. So I decided not to go back to Iraq. And at that time, I began speaking out clandestinely. I was very afraid of what the military would do to me because I knew that I had to speak out, and there were no combat veterans speaking out against the war from personal experience. And it took me about 5 months. I actually spent most of that time here in New York hiding and giving on-the-ground interviews until one good day I gathered the strength and I came forward, and on March 15th of 2004, I gave a press conference and I said, you know, this war is criminal. This is what we're doing. This war is illegal. No one signed a military contract to do the things that we're doing in Iraq. I'm not going back. And following that press conference, I surrendered myself to the closest military installation. From that time on, 2 months went by before I was court-martialed. And my court-martial, of course, was a kangaroo trial, pretty much. They denied us all the witnesses that we requested. All of our motions were struck down by the judge. And after 3 days of court-martial, the jury deliberated for 20 minutes before finding me guilty and then giving me the maximum sentence by a special court-martial, which was a year in a military prison, demotion from staff sergeant to private, and a bad conduct discharge, and forfeiture of my pay. So I went to Fort Sill, Oklahoma, and I served 9 months out of a 1-year sentence at the Regional Corrections Facility. And I got out on February 15th of 2005, and the next month I joined Iraq Veterans Against the War. Iraq Veterans Against the War was founded in Boston just the year prior to that by 7 anti-war vets. And basically what we have is 3 points of unity. So anyone who has served in the military since 9/11 and who agrees with these points of unity is welcome to join our organization. And we stand for immediate and unconditional withdrawal of all occupying forces from Iraq. We demand that the government give full benefits to all veterans and servicemen and women. And our last but not least, we demand the payment of reparations to the people of Iraq so they can rebuild their country on their own terms. So when they asked me about if I would come here and speak a few words about the state of democracy, I started thinking about what I would say. And I remember that one day I was doing homework with my daughter. I have an 8-year-old daughter. And the textbook basically had this short story about a historical figure, and the historical figure was Julius Caesar. And the character trait that they were studying was patriotism. So we began reading this paragraph, and it basically talked about how Julius Caesar had been a patriot because he had been very popular, because he had been the governor of what later became France, and also because he had been the head of entertainment, and how he was a great patriot to Rome because he basically expanded the nation, and that he went to make their country bigger. And by making their country bigger, you know, they made other people, they turned them into Roman citizens. What the paragraph didn't say is that these lands were taken by force through military operations, and that the people, a lot of the people in these new colonies were killed and turned into slaves. What the paragraph didn't tell the children was that there was great destruction in the lives and the countries of these people that they conquered, you know, in order to become colonies of Rome. So I began scratching a lot of the things that were in the paragraph, and I began highlighting things, and I began to explain to my daughter, well, this is how this is done, this is why this guy's no good, you know, and you have to realize how when you're talking about democracy, you're talking about information, you're talking about education, you're talking about people knowing their rights, people having a clear sense of history, and looking at this third grade textbook and how they've twisted the truth in order to basically beautify imperialism, you realize that we have a lot of work to do in this country. It starts from a very early age, the indoctrination, the misinformation, the lack of information, and we need to start there. We need to start with the children. Another way that they are able to get away with committing all these crimes and violating democracy is that they take away the voices from the people who actually speak the truth from personal experience. And a lot of the analysis that we do in the anti-war movement has to do with past GI resistance movements. And even during the Vietnam era, there was a lot of information being shared with the public. You know, there were horrible images of, you know, soldiers killing people in Vietnam. There was, of course, that image imprinted in everyone's mind of the little girl running away from napalm naked, and pictures of soldiers, you know, posing with dead Vietnamese. The horror of the war was not foreign to the people in this country, whereas this time they tell us that in order to honor those who have fallen, you know, we cannot videotape or photograph the coffins coming back, that we could not show the heroes who have, you know, multiple amputations, that we cannot show the destruction of the Iraqi people and their country. So it's very hard for people to oppose this war on a deeper level, because we're not really being allowed to experience the war. The voices of the veterans who are speaking out against the atrocities that are being committed in both Iraq and Afghanistan are being kept from the public because they don't want the people to take ownership of this war. That's why it's so important that we support events like this and that we support organizations like Iraq Veterans Against the War and the actions that we had. In March of this year, we all gathered in the National Labor College in Silver Springs, Maryland, and we held the Winter Soldier hearings, Iraq and Afghanistan. Over 200 of our people converged here, and we shared our experiences about the atrocities that have been committed in both Iraq and Afghanistan. We had media testimony from people from both Iraq and Afghanistan. And one of the purposes of this is to help people understand what is being done in their name and with their money. Because until people realize what the US military is doing in your name and with your money and in the name of democracy, then we're not going to be able to put an end to this crime, which is the war in Iraq and the war in Afghanistan as well. The voices of soldiers have to be heard. The voices of people who are speaking out against the official line of the government, which is being supported by the corporate media, have to be discredited and has to be replaced from, you know, or by the voices of the people who have suffered and who have participated in these wars. There's a book tour coming up by Haymarket Books. It's called Resistant Empire, and it includes my own memoir, which is about my experience in Iraq, and it also includes the Winter Soldier book, which just came out, and other wonderful books, Blackwater by Jeremy Scahill, and other authors like Joe Allen and Michael Schwartz. So I encourage you to check that out and to support that event as well. I believe the Nation Institute is also sponsoring that one. But that's one way to get involved and to find out what's happening, you know, from the people who actually have been there. In the spring of '09, there's also going to be a documentary about the Winter Soldier hearings, Iraq and Afghanistan. So I also encourage you to check that out. The director is Dave Seiger, who's produced a documentary called Sir No Sir about the GI resistance movement during the Vietnam War. And I highly recommend that you also get that and that you do screenings at home, that you share it with your friends and people. Another thing that we are beginning to deal with more frontally is the question of Afghanistan at IVAW. And this is something that I know is happening with other organizations. I know UFPJ is also questioning this. Veterans for Peace and other peace groups are beginning to take more seriously the question of Afghanistan because, well, my personal opinion is that the war in Iraq has become so indefensible, so hard to for people to accept it, that they need a new war, or they need to refocus the attention of the people onto another place in order to legitimize the global war on terror, which is the new excuse, to launch preemptive criminal wars of aggression against other countries. So we need to be aware of this shift that's taking place. We had top Marine generals talking about how they want to send their troops to Afghanistan. You have, both presidential candidates talking about how the war has to go elsewhere as well, talking about the success of the search, which is a wild fantasy. There's no success. The Iraqis are living in the worst security conditions ever right now. So it's important for us to not only question the war in Afghanistan, but also to question the entire context within which this aggression is taking place, which is the global war on terror. The global war on terror is the new word for the Cold War, basically. When you look at the global war on terror and you look at where all the key natural resources are located, that's where we are fighting terrorists. We're going after water reservoirs in South America. We're going after oil in Iraq and Afghanistan. We're going after oil pipelines connecting Middle Eastern oil to the West in Afghanistan. So it is important for us to begin questioning all of these things, not just one particular war or two wars, the entire concept of exporting democracy when we don't have democracy in this country. They're telling us that we have to build democracy in Iraq, that we have to do nation building, that we have to support these people so that, save them from themselves. Basically, they need divine Western military intervention in order not to kill each other in Iraq and Afghanistan and elsewhere where they're going. But what they're not talking about is that we cannot rebuild any other countries when our own country is falling apart. From bridges and levees, to the education and healthcare systems, people being unemployed, the entire market crashing. And as if that's not enough, then now, on top of spending hundreds of billions of dollars on preemptive criminal wars, now they're telling us that we have to spend hundreds of billions of more dollars bailing out the corporations that actually put us where we are right now. So we have to be very aware of that. We must not let that happen. Just to close, I'd like to say that I know that we have, a lot of people have hope, and I'm glad for that. We are at the gates of a new era in the United States, and basically Bush will be gone. And a lot of people are very hopeful about the future and about democracy and about, people are very engaged in the electoral process. But whatever the results and whichever candidate gets elected, I'd like to say that we cannot really go to Washington, D.C. to find democracy. We have to build democracy from the grassroots up. We have to build democracy in rallies, in anti-war marches, in events like this, by supporting the troops who are speaking out, by listening to the Iraqis and the Afghanis. It's in our hands. They're not going to give it to us. We have to take it. So let's take it. Thank you.